You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focused podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 529 of the Foreign Policy Focused podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He's a staff writer over at RT. He has bylines at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and of course at the Libertarian Institute, which is where you find this show and the daily news roundup that I write. Will, welcome back to the show.
Kyle, thanks for having me back on. How you doing?
I'm doing all right today. It's a little early. Me and Will are doing a early AM record time, but the show will come out and drop pretty much right after. So for those of you listening to it, it's some pretty fresh stuff. And we do, I think, have a pretty big show today as far as, big news topics. I mean, we're going to cover what happened in Beirut, got some updates about COVID in North Korea. But then also we want to talk a little bit about just nuclear weapons. This show is kind of set in between the 75th anniversaries of the nuclear bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Me and Will give our take, which is quite a bit different, at least than what I learned growing up in public education. So I'm guessing most people will have like the same experience where going to take on the narrative that this ended the war quickly and saved lives. But let's start off with the COVID issue here. We'll focus on some things going on here in the U.S. And even though it seems like, I don't know, at least for me, it seems like every day I see, when I go out and walk my dog in the morning, more people are going to work, or at least going somewhere at 8 a.m. I don't know where else people would go at that time other than work. Less people are wearing masks. And, I have a dog, so I'm out walking my dog. And I've noticed just in general that people are like kind of less shy or hesitant about coming up to me, especially since, I'm walking my dog. I rarely have a mask on. His leash is 6 feet long. I know exactly how far 6 feet is. And so, I feel pretty confident that I'm not going to be that close to somebody, so I don't have to wear a mask. But I notice, people are just more comfortable with me. Yet, this isn't in any way reflective of what I'm hearing from governments and what government responses are. Rather than opening up, it looks like, we're getting some more extreme authoritarianism. And so talk about what's going on in LA.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, like, as you said, there've been sort of moves to reopen a little bit. There've been, there's been some backpedaling on that as well, because as you're saying in media, we're hearing all about this new spike in cases. And certainly we are seeing like the official tallies are swelling in some areas, especially in like the South. But even here in Michigan, up in the Midwest, like we're seeing a minor spike in cases. I've said before, I don't claim to know what all explains that. I've seen some, fairly compelling people, be skeptical toward that and say this is just, the numbers are getting inflated. But, I'm open to the idea that there's also like a real resurgence of the virus. People are being less careful or something. However, regardless of what explains this spike in cases we're seeing, in LA this week, I think on Wednesday, the mayor of the city, Eric Garcetti, imposed like a very draconian, I think the most draconian restriction or containment measure that I've seen so far. I mean, in Michigan, we had a fairly draconian regulation where our governor said we can't go and even visit private residences. Like we're not even allowed to have very small gatherings. However, in LA now, the mayor is now threatening that anyone who holds any kind of large gathering, and they haven't really defined that very clearly, but whatever they're calling a large gathering, they're now threatening that they're going to cut the water and power utilities off to these homes. And they're saying that they're going to now treat, private residences the same way they would treat like a bar or a nightclub, which they've threatened to shut down utilities for those establishments. But now they're saying they're going to do this to your home. And they did say, only after repeat complaints, and the police would have to go and confirm and verify that there was really a large gathering. But nonetheless, they are threatening to shut down people's utilities now. And the mayor is like completely strident about this. Garcetti is saying, this is fully legal. I've consulted with the city attorneys. But, it seems like a very extreme measure. And I do expect, I haven't seen anything yet. It's only been a few days, but I do expect this to come under some legal challenge. I mean, this is a pretty intense restriction or threat to impose.
Right. And so do we have any idea if there's exemptions or anything like that here? I know various religious communities, kind of reject a lot of the modern science and medicine and how that's supposed to affect their tradition. This was, quite a problem in New York with some kind of Orthodox Jews there. I know there's Christian scientist types who are opposed to medicine, or even just, are there any exceptions? Let's say, somebody had a kid and they want to have a baptism, first birthday, wedding. That's something that is personally, impacting me right now. I'm engaged, but kind of hard to plan a wedding because you kind of have no idea how many people you'll be able to get together. For most people, 10 person get together really is more extensive than, in our case, both of our immediate families, brothers, parents, grandparents are all, take up far more than 10 or 15 people you would be allowed in most cases. So are there exemptions for anything like this? Is there any understanding for the fact that life goes on? And, not to mention, this has been going on 6 months now. There's, tens of thousands of babies born. And I'm sure for, a lot of grandparents and older people who, socializing is extremely important to their mental health. It must be hell, to have, sat around for all these months and not be able to hold your grandchild or, your newborn grandchild, see, your families and stuff like that. So is there any consideration for this at all? Or is it just, government knows what's best. Government knows that the meaning of life is just how many breaths you could possibly take, and that we're doing everything possible to extend human life no matter how meaningless we make it?
No, unfortunately, it is the latter, as far as I can tell here. In terms of this new threat to, shut down utilities, I didn't actually see any written order for this. I just saw Garcetti announce this, and he said this during a press conference. However, the actual formal coronavirus order for LA County right now just prohibits, it says, any large gathering that could be threatening to public health. And so that's a very broad mandate. And so I think that this sort of threat to, shut down utilities, I think that's just an extension of the overall county order. And so, no, I don't think there are exemptions. I think this is a very broad sweeping mandate where they can, they can impose it. Doesn't matter if it's a religious gathering or a funeral or a house party. And that's really been the thing that Garcetti was really talking about. There's been all these big house parties in the Hollywood Hills and other parts of LA. And there's that's what he was pointing to, is these private gatherings. But I think this applies to any gathering whatsoever.
Right. So I'm just, thinking here, if he goes out at a press conference and just says this, that's even worse than Donald Trump. At least he'll put it on Twitter so everybody can see it in writing. You know what I mean? It's just crazy where we are and how willing people are to accept all this with coronavirus, even if you're somebody who's fairly scared and taking it seriously. And, I definitely see people's perspective, especially those who either are older or in any way immune compromised and have to be a lot more careful with this stuff, to be nervous and scared of it or something like that. But just to think man, maybe we should be going through the correct procedures here. All these people who call for mask mandates and everything like that, if this was enforced, let's say that Donald Trump said, I heard you, I'm taking coronavirus serious as hell, I'm going to arrest anybody outside without masks. I think the majority of the arrests would have come at Black Lives Matter protests. You know what I mean? So it seems awfully problematic to me that we're calling for this and this kind of blanket authoritarianism, and it's happening without any kind of due process or procedure. Hell, even look at how they passed the $2-4 trillion stimulus bill. If it wasn't for Tom Massey, they wouldn't have even had to have a quorum of members in the House. They just would have passed $4 trillion of spending on unanimous consent. So I don't know. It seems like this is a trend that's getting worse, and I'll let you add anything you want there after my little rant. Less of a question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the last thing I'd say here is like I certainly hope this would be the case that like maybe Garcetti is just saying this. He's just trying to scare people and spook them out of having gatherings or something. And maybe this doesn't have any real legal teeth to it. I kind of doubt that. I kind of expect that he does mean business by this. But I think that's at least possible that he's just trying to spook people and this is just a threat. And I guess that would be better than him actually, shutting off somebody's water or power because they decide to have a couple friends over. That's just outrageous.
All right, well, so let's move on and talk about what happened in Beirut. It's the capital of Lebanon. They have this beautiful, beautiful port. A lot of people think of like Lebanon as the Middle East, but if you look at the city itself, it looks very Western. And from my understanding, a lot of like very wealthy Westerners like will vacation in Lebanon. I'm guessing less of that's going on right now with the COVID. But in general, it's, very wealthy, a very nice area. And a lot of, I think the very, nice area and other kind of stuff is, around the coastline where, this a massive explosion happened. And so I think everybody has probably seen the videos of this because it's just one of those things that's, captured the attention of everyone. In the immediate aftermath, the speculation ranged from inappropriately stored Hezbollah munitions to an Israeli. I saw people suggesting that Israeli nuked the port. And now I guess I get it for people who maybe haven't watched many videos of attacks. And this was like legitimately one of the largest explosions I've seen captured on like high definition, smartphone video recording. That's really saying something. Like this was a massive explosion, and there's over 100 people at least confirmed dead right now. So Will, I'll let you go into all the details about it and tell us what we know about this event so far.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, there was this gigantic explosion in the capital of Lebanon on Tuesday. And it basically flattened like the, much of the port area and, did a lot of damage to the surrounding area around the port, too. I think they had said there was like smashed windows in buildings 6 miles away from the blast site. And it flipped cars over. And, so we're talking like a very powerful blast here, a significant explosion. And you kind of referred to this, the casualty figures, they've kind of been steadily going up over the last few days as they're kind of, pulling people out of the rubble and they have more time to count them up. But as of this recording, as of early Friday morning, I think there was around 150 deaths that have been confirmed and more than 5,000 people injured. And there are still apparently hundreds missing, people buried in the rubble. There's some, first responders who are missing. And so these numbers are probably going to go up in the coming days and weeks here as they're, sorting this all out. And, you can go and see this. I'm sure many people have. You can see this explosion from like 12 or 15 different angles online. It was captured in all kinds of videos. It sent this gigantic mushroom cloud into the sky, and you can see there's a visible shockwave. So this is like a very impressive and terrifying blast. And in terms of what caused this, the Lebanese authorities are still looking into this. They haven't come out with any kind of conclusive explanation. But the most likely story right now that I've seen, just in terms of the reading that I've done, is that a fire at a warehouse at the port, which may have been started by a welding accident, I think was one of the more common suggestions. But that this fire, eventually set off over 2,700 metric tons of ammonium nitrate that was stored in a nearby depot at the port. And there have been some conflicting reports all about this, so a lot of this should be taken with some grains of salt. But it does look like that initial fire may have been at a warehouse that was storing fireworks. So you can see in some of the footage before the big explosion, you can see what looks to be fireworks like going off in the fire. So you apparently had this very dangerous mix, this combination of like pyrotechnics and a fire and this huge store of ammonium nitrate that was apparently stored just like right, in the vicinity of this fire at the port.
Can I jump in real quick? And I just want to expand on the welding thing because a friend of ours, Joanne Leone, interviewed the great Middle East reporter Elijah Magnier on this. And I'll go ahead and link to that episode in the show notes page. It came out within the past couple hours. I mean, Joanne got quite a score with interviewing Elijah so early. And what he explained is that he kind of chalks it up to incompetence, and we could get into more of that later. But essentially, a mechanic was hired to drill a hole in one of the doors in the warehouse where the ammonium nitrate was stored. wasn't informed that the ammonium nitrate was there, and the hole that he was ordered to drill was just, I think Elijah said, centimeters away from the ammonium nitrate. And so, if you're drilling through like very thick metal, it creates a lot of heat. And so, this guy is drilling for an hour, whatever holes, pats up and leaves. And then according to Elijah's story, whatever kind of, small spark needed, just slowly built, that eventually, I guess, gets so hot it catches the fireworks on fire. But that's like almost unrelated. Like that's like a fire that's subsequent to the main ammonium nitrate fire and then explosion. And eventually the ammonium nitrate fire builds until it explodes. And that was the narrative in a little bit more detail that I heard from Elijah. And I guess it made sense from the video recordings that I've seen, whereas, the reports, even before you see video recordings, is that there was just a small amount of smoke. Fire crews responded. Elijah said that the fire, crews weren't told what was in this facility. And, had they been told and had they been, appropriately trained, I don't know if they, would have made the right call. But I guess the solution here was, pretty easy, that we just need to evacuate and get as many people away from the port as possible. And so, those are a couple kinds of steps where government incompetence can help this situation. But I'll let you hop back in with the narrative, Will.
Right, sure. And like as you're saying, yeah, it's not totally clear like what role the fireworks played. Like there were the earlier reports seemed to be more focused on the fireworks. It seems like, based, like I said, some of the footage seemed to show you could see little things like popping off there, but it's not totally clear what role that played. What we're really talking about here is the ammonium nitrate. That's really what caused this. And ammonium nitrate is mostly used in fertilizers. It's like a very common application for it, but it's also the main ingredient in like industrial grade explosives like ANFO. And it's a very, volatile and dangerous substance, and especially when you're storing it in like gigantic quantities like they had there in that warehouse. And, maybe we can start to now get into like how that ended up there. And so, this is all based on reports. Some of the stuff is still fairly sketchy, but I think this part is pretty clear that it was a Russian-owned, but I think it was flying under Moldovan flags, but a cargo ship, the NV Rosis, that got stuck there at this port in Beirut in 2013 on its way to Mozambique. And I haven't been able to get like a real clear answer on this aspect of it, but for one reason or another, like whether it was equipment failures or there was some issue with money, I think the ship was like in a lot of debt, or there was some kind of legal problem in Beirut. But for one reason or another, the ship was not allowed to leave the port when it got there in 2013, and the crew ended up abandoning it, and it was like in this gigantic financial hole. It was a huge mess. But this big store of ammonium nitrate on board was eventually confiscated by the local authorities there in Lebanon. They're in the port, basically, these port authorities. And apparently they just never found like a safe place to store this stuff. And they just kind of like chucked it into this shabby looking warehouse where it sat for like over 6 years, I think. And there's actually a photo that's been going around where that's supposedly showing the warehouse. And if that's a genuine photo, then it does look like an outrageously terrible way to store an explosive chemical. Like it just sort of like dumped in there in these big like open containers haphazardly. And so if indeed that is how they were storing this like nearly 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, it's actually kind of amazing that this didn't happen sooner, honestly, that it actually took 6 years for something to go wrong with this, because that was just like a disaster waiting to happen.
Can I just jump in with one more piece of context here too? Is I know Timothy McVeigh used a similar version of ammonium nitrate, although I think he used something else too in his Oklahoma City bomb. But just to compare, I think that was like 2.5 tons of ammonium nitrate that he used. And it wasn't stored improperly for 6 years. And it wasn't, I think, quite as packed into a ship as his was packed into that Ryder truck. So just for a little bit, I guess, go and look at the Oklahoma City building, which was like absolutely wrecked. Like the front of that building is blown off. And so then you will understand why storing all of this together for so long was, as Will said, lucky that we didn't actually have this sooner.
Right. And if people also want to, like, as a matter of comparison, over at RT, we actually interviewed like a chemical physicist who's an expert in like detonations and that kind of, that field. And he was comparing this blast to a 2001 explosion in France at a fertilizer factory in Toulouse. And that was the same substance. It was ammonium nitrate. But there, I think it was like 300 tons. And that ended up killing 30 people and wounding like 2,500. But like, that was still a major catastrophe. And that was just with 300 tons. And so like, there've been, some examples of this before. And it is fairly common knowledge that this is like a dangerous explosive chemical. It's not like this is some secret. And so it is kind of odd that, like, it's been reported that the government in Lebanon was made aware of this multiple times and on multiple different levels of government, that, the huge danger this thing posed. But apparently no one ever did anything about it. Looks like there was just like, I don't know how they could have done this, but there's just serious negligence from many different parties. It seems like the blame would have to go around a lot. Like, I don't know if you could just pin this on one person. But now in Lebanon, they are starting to look into like who may have been responsible for this, for this stockpile of chemicals. And they've now placed a bunch of like port authorities under house arrest. But they still haven't come out with any kind of like comprehensive account of what happened or like who did what, or, they haven't, placed responsibility with anyone. So we're still kind of waiting for that probe to conclude. I'm not super confident that we are going to get like, real good answers. I expect the government's just going to find someone to point the finger at. But I imagine there's probably, several layers of government who probably should have known and done something about this, before 6 or 7 years went by. But the last I'd seen, they're estimating this explosion did like $10 to $15 billion in damage. I've seen varying estimates. I've seen some as low as like 3 billion, but the upper end was potentially 15 billion US dollars in damage. And it left something like 300,000 people homeless just because it like destroyed a lot of houses and apartments and kind of made them like unlivable. So this is devastating for Lebanon. They were already having a lot of problems. They were having, they had an economic crisis. They had widespread protests because of corruption, because of that economic crisis. There have been ongoing, geopolitical tensions between Hezbollah, the Shia militia in southern Lebanon, and the Israelis. They've had the coronavirus. And so now they have to deal with this. So it's been like a real hell of a year for Lebanon.
And I think uniquely impacted by the Caesar sanctions and all the sanctions on Syria, as well as sanctions against Iran.
Right.
And how that's impacted the economy. I guess another video I want to recommend, and I'll link to this one in the show notes as well, is of Rania, Khalik, and she interviewed somebody else who's also in Lebanon. I guess Rania was in Beirut at the time of the explosion. She's wow. Okay. I think she was away from the city when it happened, but she took some pictures of her apartment, which isn't like she doesn't have an ocean view or I guess a sea view or anything, and it's clear that there's significant damage there. So it seems like that this is like, at least for me, it seemed like a good way to get like kind of an on the ground feel what people of Lebanon are feeling. And a lot of people seem like just pretty shocked, and there's like a general sense of like this was just a terrible thing. To get, I guess, into a little bit more of what you were talking about there, Will, and back to the interview that Joanne did with Elijah Magnier, one of the things that he pointed out with fault here is that in the Middle East, there's a real habit, and this happens everywhere, but a real habit of government officials getting jobs based on no qualifications at all, and rather, just who paid the right bribe to the right person. And so I think he pointed out that it was actually Saad Hariri, who's the former prime minister of Lebanon. Lebanon has like this weird government structure that's based on religious sets. So there's the president, who's a Maronite Christian, Michael Annan. Then you have the prime minister, who I'm not sure who's in that position now, was Saad Hariri. That's a Sunni. And then the speaker of the parliament, which is right now Narsala, and that's a Hezbollah Shiite. And so, that's kind of the way that breaks down. But I'm guessing that just the way, if power is instituted like that along those lines, then, all the positions that Saad Hariri gets to point out are all the people that like he needs to like keep in line to keep his Sunni coalition together, so he has the support to be prime minister. And so he makes sure that whoever's in charge of the port, which I'm sure is a a way to make a lot of money because, you let a lot of stuff get smuggled into the port and everything. At the same time, you're probably not picking the most qualified candidate. And so, maybe if you had somebody that really understood shipping and everything, would have been horrified by this situation and would have been, going and talking to the prime minister 3 times a week and saying like, look, you got a mini nuclear bomb sitting in your port. What are you going to do about it? No, I know it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but his job was to exaggerate this problem to get it resolved. And that obviously didn't happen. And then assuming that the details of the story that Elijah told before, that we talked about before, are true, again, it's just the general people working in this area not really understanding what's aboard that ship and how dangerous it is also a major failure of government. And so for me, this is just another one of those, times where you're like, oh, this is why you're a libertarian, because if there was somebody who owned that port, right, and that guy has an insurance company, that insurance company would have been calling that guy 4 times a day, being like, when are you going to get this ship out of your port? You're not covered for it. This is crazy. What are, like, this is a huge liability and risk, and it only gets to sit unnoticed because of government incompetence. And it's absolutely disturbing. And so I don't know anything else you have, Will. The only other thing I really had to mention on this was that while for at least us on this show, I think it'll be weeks, if not months, before we really talk about who's at fault here. The Warhawks, etc., are all focused on the anti-Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, and spinning this into propaganda. So is I guess there anything to that propaganda, or is it just making stuff up to target those kind of the groups we see as nefarious in the Middle East?
Yeah, I'll start with the first part of just like addressing like there does seem to be this sort of diffusion of responsibility when you have like a government overseeing this kind of thing where like no one person really has the job to figure it out. And boy, what a pain in the this would be to try to figure out if you're unqualified, if you're just some random guy who's put in there for, reasons of nepotism or, you paid someone. Like how are you going to solve this problem? Like it's a huge problem that would require a lot of logistics and all this stuff. And a lot of the time these government officials are just totally ill-equipped and not even willing to want to solve it. It's just a pain in their neck they would like to brush under the rug, which is apparently what happened here until we had a disaster. But yeah, the last thing that I wanted to mention and hit on sort of ties into what you just asked me about, like, the Warhawks pushing to pin this on, one of the various U.S. adversaries. And the thing I wanted to hit on was just like we had Donald Trump, the president, talking about, he said multiple times, he's kind of doubled down on this suggestion that he's saying the Pentagon and his generals have told him that, oh, this was an attack of some kind, that there was some kind of bomb used. And he's like very skeptical that this could have just been like an accident with a, explosive chemical going off. And similarly, I've seen a lot of videos and stuff going around on Twitter and people just claiming this kind of stuff of, alleging that this was an attack of some sort. A lot of the people sort of in our orbit, are, broadly speaking, would be saying, oh, this is an Israeli attack. But then, of course, you do have the more like hawkish people on the side of the U.S. national security state who'd be looking to blame Iran or Hezbollah or some other, U.S. boogeyman. And I would say, like, I would really urge people to be cautious about, buying into these things, especially these videos. I had someone sending me a few videos earlier today asking me, like, it looks clearly in this video like a missile is hit. They inverted the video and, oh, look, you can see a missile now striking. However, if you go and look through Twitter, you can see quite a few different videos where people have clearly debunked it. They've shown like the original, which has no missile, and they show how someone added that into it. So I'd really caution people that even if you see something that looks fairly compelling, like that's a missile, like I saw earlier, it was like, well, that clearly does look like a missile, but, is this edited is always the question you should be asking. Right. So certainly for any kind of claims like this, whether they're claiming this is an Israeli missile or whether they're claiming it's Iran or whatever the party is, I would be very skeptical and ask for evidence. And then even when you sometimes get evidence like these videos, you even still have to be skeptical of that.
Right. I was going to say my skepticism comes just from, if this thing just exploded, like you can't see any fire, the thing goes off, then it makes a little bit more sense to think missile. But it was smoldering for an hour. And so what, the Israelis lit it on fire for an hour with a smoke grenade and then hit it with a missile? You know what I mean? There's like a lot of narrative that needs explaining if that's the claim that you're trying to make. And so it seems like, there's a big gap between like, not that it's impossible that this wasn't somehow an act of Israeli sabotage. Who knows? Maybe Mossad got the driller. You know what I mean? Like there are certainly possibilities where this was some kind of nefarious act by Israel, the U.S., Saudi Arabia. I don't know. Like there's plenty of potential actors here, but at the same time, the missiles narrative has a lot of holes, and so I don't know. I see a lot of people pushing that, and again, quit to blame Israel, and I'm not even saying like. I know everybody then uses the like, anti-Semitism. I don't think it's that. Everybody just understands in the Middle East that Israel doesn't get along with Hezbollah. There's been a lot of conflict around the two lately. And so it wouldn't be impossible for it to be an act of Israeli sabotage. But at this time, there just doesn't seem to be evidence for that at all.
Right. Absolutely.
I guess the last thing, I said last thing twice now, that I just wanted to mention was the impact that this will have on the region, especially because of U.S. sanctions. From my understanding, a lot of the stuff that gets into Syria does so through the port of Beirut. And so this is going to be a problem for a country that's in desperate need right now. And I'm sure it's even worse because from some video I saw, it looked like there were some Western Syrian cities and hospitals that were actually treating patients because I guess just the sheer number of like lacerations and stuff like that from this glass exploding and the shockwave like it was has caused just a lot of like problems that need hospitalization, but hospitals are overwhelmed. And I don't think are necessarily like fatal as long as people can get some care. So I saw that going on. I'm just, wondering what's the like longer term impact on the region. And then, with the special note of the U.S. has sanctioned so many, bodies in the region, and Lebanon has an in part hostile relationship with Israel. I mean, parts of the government, I guess, get along better with Israel than Hezbollah, but it has the hostile relationship with Israel and Turkey, and so it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of options for Lebanon, because Syria sanctioned, their ports destroyed. So I don't know if you have anything to weigh in on the sanctions, Will.
Well, just in terms of like the broader like geopolitical fallout of this, like I think that is something that's going to, it remains to be seen. Like I think especially if the Lebanese government decides they're going to start pointing fingers at, in some direction, they might throw us a curveball that could certainly play into this. But yeah, I think, this may have some longer term impact in the region.
All right, well, let's talk about nukes. The first thing, let's keep it on current day and talk about North Korea's weapons program. You had an article out this week that I thought was interesting on a UN report about North Korea's ability to miniaturize nuclear bombs. So maybe just first highlight a little bit why it would be important for North Korea to miniaturize the nuclear weapon, and then get into if they have the ability to do it or not.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, I was going to explain this a little bit. Like some people in your audience are probably aware of this, but with nuclear weapons, it's not just enough to like develop a bomb, like just to make a device that's capable of setting off a nuclear reaction and a blast. But you have to be able to actually make it small enough so that it can fit into a missile, so that you can actually like launch it from one continent to another. And that's this is what they call miniaturization. And as far as I understand, this is like a fairly complicated and technically difficult stage in developing like a usable nuclear weapon. And it's not that easy to pull off. And so this, though, is what this UN report is saying that North Korea has accomplished, that they've actually successfully miniaturized a nuclear warhead to fit on a missile, like one of their own missiles in their arsenal. And this report came out on Monday, or at least the report, like the news coverage of the UN report came out on Monday. I think Reuters got it first, and it didn't. We didn't get really the whole report. We just kind of got like little bits and pieces of it. But the most interesting conclusion of it, and this is concluded by a panel of independent experts for this report that was prepared for the Sanctions on North Korea Committee of the UN Security Council. So this panel of independent experts set up this report, and its biggest conclusion is that North Korea has developed a miniaturization of their warheads. Now, I should point out that the language that they use in this report doesn't really suggest that they're very confident about this. They use the word probably. They say North Korea has probably miniaturized a nuke. And we're not really even told who's making these claims. You know, we don't know what UN member states might be contributing this information. We don't really know what independent experts they're talking about, so-called, on this panel that they used. So that is kind of important to mention that, like, this is all anonymous and we don't even see their evidence, assuming they even actually have any evidence. Another thing, too, is that this is not the first time it has been claimed that North Korea was able to fit a warhead onto one of their ballistic missiles. Because back in 2017, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon's intelligence wing, they concluded the same thing a couple of years ago. They said that they had miniaturized a nuke, and then last year we also had Japanese intelligence suggesting again the same thing, that they had miniaturized a bomb. And so this claim does seem to pop up from time to time, and it does seem that each time it does pop up, it's almost like it was never said before. It's just like they just repeat it as if it was a new thing each time. However, even though this is kind of a sketchy assessment here, it's not very compelling at all. They didn't really come up with any evidence, and all they could really say was probably. The likely effect of this, I think, though, is to help to justify continued UN sanctions on North Korea over its nuclear program, nuclear weapons program, which were first imposed on North Korea back in 2006. And so ultimately, I think that's the direction they're going to try to spin this in, even if it's kind of a flimsy report. I think this is kind of going to help to keep sanctions on North Korea over their nuclear program. And the North Koreans have consistently argued that they only have nukes to stave off an invasion. Just a week or two ago, Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader, was saying the same thing. He's saying that their nuclear arsenal has prevented war and has kept them from being invaded. So whether or not you want to believe them, that is the position that they've staked out all along. And but the UN, though, and most Western states that would be in the U.S. orbit, refuse to accept this. And this is unacceptable to them to have a nuclear-armed North Korea. So that has really allowed diplomacy, primarily between North Korea and the United States, to really start faltering. And we kind of covered this in detail in an article that we wrote together. What was it? Maximum Failure, I think, was the title, where we get into the decaying diplomacy between the U.S. and North Korea because of this consistent demand that they get rid of their nuclear arsenal. And so I would say basically that is sort of the effect this UN report is going to have, is to gin up justifications to keep these sanctions on North Korea and to gin up more arguments about how, they must give up their nuclear weapons program.
Right. And, just how delusional it is that North Korea having nuclear weapons, having the knowledge to make nuclear weapons and having nuclear power plants, they want North Korea to dismantle their nuclear weapons program and then unlearn the knowledge somehow of how to make nuclear weapons. They want verifiable, and then irreversible, it's impossible to reverse the nuclear weapons process in North Korea since they already have the knowledge that they have. And this is something that's come up a lot in our discussions around the Iranian nuclear program, is there's so many dual use technologies and uses for, everything you need to run a nuclear power plant. I guess, you could probably run a nuclear power plant without the technology to make a nuclear bomb. But at the same time, if you're running an efficient nuclear program for a larger civilian population, you're probably going to have the ability to scale up what you're doing a little bit, refine, the stuff a little bit more, and then you'll quickly have the material you need. What I think they call the fissile material that you need for the bomb. And so, with North Korea being where they are, it's not necessarily that they could reverse their nuclear program back to 2001, where they didn't have a bomb and only had a rudimentary nuclear weapons program. It's just the idea that we could do that is silly. And so at what point, Will, is the U.S. going to look at this situation in reality, like Obama did one time with Iran, and say, there's a best case scenario we could negotiate with here, and then we could make friends with North Korea and not have to worry about their nukes?
Yeah, it does seem like the U.S. just sort of takes this overall approach that North Korea just has to bow to our whim, and that to even begin talks about anything, to even start negotiations, to even begin talking about relieving sanctions, they have to capitulate and do everything we say first. And, as we explained in our article, that is not a winning strategy with North Korea. They have not been receptive to that at all. They will gladly just be isolated and let themselves be sanctioned. They're clearly not going to bow to this. It's been decades that we've been trying this approach. And it seems like each time we kind of lighten up a little bit, Bill Clinton was able to negotiate the agreed framework. Trump even had a little window where he seemed to be making some progress with the North Koreans. And he was sort of relaxing these demands about, get rid of your nuclear arsenal. And it seemed like we were making progress. There were talks, there were summits, there were some like commitments made, the freeze for freeze deal that happened. It seemed like we were actually making some headway. But then we had, John Bolton, the former national security advisor to Trump, kind of come in and convince him to re-adopt this more hawkish approach, where we're going to demand they give away the whole farm before, we even lift a finger to do anything. And so this is just sort of the way the U.S. deals with a lot of countries in the world, not only North Korea, but it's really on display in our relations with them.
Right. I just imagine if John Bolton had a heart attack or fell down some stairs 2 weeks before Hanoi, how different the world may be. And I guess that, just realizing too how arbitrary it is that we still have all this hostility and how much planning and money that we spend trying to combat North Korea militarily. I mean, we probably spend more, and I know a lot of it's actually for China, but claiming that we have all these military assets in the region for North Korea than North Korea even has in GDP. I mean, the GDP of the country is absolutely minuscule. Other than having nuclear weapons, they don't have much. So just, make it not an issue that North Korea wants to nuke you or South Korea, and everything will be good. It's not like, they're trying to extort the world with their nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un's not sitting there with his pinky on his lip like Dr. Evil saying, I want $100 billion. He's saying, please, lift the blockade against my country. That's what North Korea is looking for. I think this is a great conversation to have, especially where we are 75 years now between the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I guess I just want to start with what I had believed about the nuclear bombings for I guess most of my life up until probably the past 5 years or so, where I really sat down and did some reading. And then this year I did a lot more reading, working for antiwar.com, trying to get my head around all the nuclear weapons implications and stuff like that. There's great, the little book and article published in the New Yorker by John Hershey on Hiroshima is a great job telling that story. But the fate story that you learn is that, at this time, the U.S. essentially had Japan beat, but they were just, completely intransigent and refusing to surrender. And, the U.S. had bombed a few of their cities with different weapons, and that hadn't gotten them to quit. And so Truman saying that, I have two options here. One says I do the nuclear bombings. We're going to pick cities with military targets, and, we're going to get a lot of knowledge from it, and it's going to be a show force to the Soviets. But the main point is that this is going to get the Japanese to surrender when they otherwise wouldn't. And then the second option he had was an invasion and occupation of Japan against a hostile power. And I've seen estimates that this was going to kill 2 million Americans and millions more Japanese. And, as ugly as some of the nuclear stuff was, at least it wasn't an invasion. And so, Will, I'll let you start with that myth.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is there's so many directions we could go with this discussion about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, as you said, we're pretty much smack dab right in between those two dates. Hiroshima, I think, was August 6th, and Nagasaki was on the 9th, and it's the 7th now. So we're right in between them. But yeah, I think one of the primary myth about this bombing, the atomic bombings of Japan, was that the U.S. had no choice, basically. That, the story, you pretty much just summarized the story that, had we not done this, we were going to attempt this big land invasion, and that would have seen more bloodshed on both sides, so it was really all worth it. Sometimes you hear people, for a long time, I think the number that was thrown around was 46,000 Americans. But that's gone up a lot. George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., once in a speech said something about how it saved millions of American lives. So this number gets exaggerated higher and higher and higher over the years. But it's simply not the case. A land invasion was not necessary at this stage of the war. And many key figures in the government and the military at the time have admitted this pretty clearly. Like, there's not much of a question about this. And I can run down some examples of like where we see this in the historical record.
Can I just add one more detail, something interesting that I saw? And this is like the first year that I've seen it, but a lot of the commentary on the like nuclear, bomb dropping from the American side is now written by children or grandchildren of the veterans of that war. And so like, I think at least 5 or 6 different articles I read started with, I wouldn't be here today had Truman decided to drop the bomb, assuming that, their grandfather then would have been in the invasion and died. And so I think that's now like a part of the common American narrative on this. And you were just talking about, and it reminded me, and I thought was just such an interesting thing that, we now believe that there are probably even more millions of us, right? Because like there's millions of GIs that would have been deployed to Japan in this theoretical invasion that was never going to happen. But so then you take now all their children and grandchildren saying, well, I wouldn't be alive. You're looking at like tens of millions of Americans who believe that their life is dependent on Truman dropping the bomb.
Right. This is really like proliferated. Now it's sort of like the common story. And that's why I think it is so important to like debunk this. And just starting to do that, we can look at this document produced by what was called the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Group. And this group of people of the military was ordered by President Truman to like create a report on the American air campaign on Japan in 1946. So this is like pretty much right after the war. And this report concluded, quote, based on a detailed investigation of all the facts and supported by the testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the survey's opinion that Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. So that's a fairly clear, conclusion here about like whether this was really needed. That this bombing survey group was confident that Japan would have surrendered between November and December 1945. Without any bomb even being dropped, without any invasion, and without the Russians even being involved. Because the Russians also had like the Russians were putting Japan also in a very compromised position at the time we dropped the bomb. So they were also like threatening sort of an invasion, or at least posturing there. And so this, strategic bombing survey group is pretty clear. But you also have Ike Eisenhower, who was a top general at the time, but later became the president, obviously. And he at one point wrote, I think in his memoirs or in his diary, that, quote, the Japanese were ready to surrender and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. And there's actually quite a bit of other documentary evidence that, senior American officials were aware that Japan was ready to surrender for some time before the war actually ended, before the bomb was used, as Eisenhower suggested there. And that we had intercepted Japanese communiques that were very openly stating the emperor was like anxious to end the war. And, it was sort of known that they wanted to surrender, but that they just wanted to do it with honor. They wanted to sort of like save face, given their very like honor oriented culture in Japan. But at the time, the U.S. knew this and apparently ignored it and demanded complete unconditional surrender or, be wiped off the map. And so that's what we did. But the terrible irony of all this, too, though, is that we ultimately did allow Japan to save face. We did allow them to keep their emperor on the throne in sort of a ceremonial role. And that was one of the things the Japanese were kind of talking about in terms of saving face before the bombs were dropped. So this is all like kind of pointless. We refused to accept this conditional surrender or like, that we kind of knew they were willing to do. But then we allowed that condition in the end anyway. But, just continuing on with some of these quotes, we also have Admiral William D. Leahy, who's the highest ranking military officer serving during World War II. So, these are all like the very most high ranking military officials I'm citing here. And,
right. Don't they say like 7 of the 8 5-star generals opposed this? I think is the number, but I could have it could be like 6 or 7 or something. But it was almost all of the 5-star military generals that actually opposed the plan. Only one did.
Right, exactly. It was the majority of like the senior military command. And among them was this Admiral William D. Leahy. And he wrote, quote, the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make wars in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children. So that was the highest ranking military officer during World War II. That was his take on, said it had no material assistance in the war against Japan. You had Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War at the time. And he was one of the more hawkish ones. He was actually not too bothered by the bombing of Japan. But he wrote in his diary that he was, quote, fearful that Japan would be so bombed out that by the time we got to use this brand new weapon on them, that we would not, quote, not have a fair background to show its strength of the nuclear weapon. And so he's basically saying that Japan was like a bombed out shell of its former self, and they were basically all but defeated. And it was not really necessary to nuke them or, carry out a land invasion. I think that's sort of what he implies there. And similarly, also, one of the General Curtis LeMay, who oversaw the air campaign on the Pacific, he complained to Stimson that there would be nothing left in Japan to bomb except for, quote, garbage can targets. So he's also suggesting here there was no value in using a nuke and that Japan was already defeated.
Right. Isn't Curtis LeMay is nicknamed Bombs Away because this is just a guy who loved that's actually this guy's nickname, Curtis Bombs Away LeMay. And I was just going to add in there really quick, something about the story that kind of is like really disturbing and dark is that, and if you read John Hershey's piece on Hiroshima, that the city hadn't been bombed. And so leading up into that, I guess the Americans, part of the reason they hadn't bombed the city is they wanted to have that, quote unquote background to see what the bomb would actually do to a city. And I don't know, like in a way, it seems like these people were just like a science experiment to the U.S. government, which is just so dark in so many ways. And it's really a hard thing to wrap your mind around, that they would intentionally not bomb a city so that they could later nuke it. Is crazy. But it I think was for me really insightful into the mindset of Truman and his advisors who did go ahead and approve the nuclear bombing.
Right. Another thing too about these two cities was like they were fairly unimportant, like minor industrial cities. They had almost no military value. And there is a reason, like you're saying. I think this is one of the reasons why we did not target those cities in our firebombing campaign. That it didn't really have that much military value. It didn't, nor industrial value. And the industrial buildings and the factories and stuff that were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were all clustered around like the outskirts of the towns. Yet in both cases, we dropped our nuclear bombs on the center of those cities, which basically like maximized the civilian death, and it minimized any conceivable benefit this could have had to our war effort. So it was really, like in so many ways unnecessary. And, I don't think we mentioned this killed an estimated 200,000 people, I think is like the general rough estimate. It goes, some go higher, some go lower. And most of them were civilians, and about half of those people died within, the minutes and hours following the blasts. They were either instantly incinerated or they were mortally injured and died hours later. But then the rest, the other half, died, like in the days and weeks later of horrible, horrific burns and radiation poisoning. And so that's sort of like there's a lot of, you can kind of go down this rabbit hole online and just like read a lot of firsthand accounts of the aftermath of these blasts. And it's some of the most horrific things you can possibly imagine. It's absolutely a nightmare. But, in terms of all these quotes from military officers, there's another rabbit hole that I would really encourage your audience to go down if they haven't already, to just go and look and just see how much of a consensus there really is that like this is kind of a settled question, that like all of the main military figures at the time agreed that this was not necessary. And this is pretty much just an atrocity, plain and simple. This is a war crime. We killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. And ultimately, the effect was really to show off our power to the Soviet Union, as you kind of mentioned. It was a show of force for them. But the result of that was to kick off like a decades-long arms race throughout the whole Cold War. And so other than the mass incineration of hundreds of thousands of human beings, of babies and grandmas and women and children, this was the real outcome of the bombings, was to kick off an arms race and to generate even more conflict. So I do really think it is important to recall like this history, not only this week, but year-round too. It's relevant in so many ways to the present, and just kind of gives you a real insight into how war works, how government works, how the state works, and just their willingness to unleash unfathomable violence on innocent people.
Right. There are two more things that I wanted to mention that I think often go unmentioned. The first is that an interesting part of this is all Truman just like took the authority that the president has the ability to, I guess it was the commander in chief authority, but carry out even a nuclear weapon strike against a mostly civilian population, without like any kind of congressional approval, and kind of just assume the unilateral presidential authority to use nuclear weapons that still exists today. and is really something that's like I think never largely been debated in any way. And then the other thing is that Nagasaki happened 3 days after Hiroshima, as if the first nuclear bombing wasn't enough, and those dastardly Japanese thought somehow they're still going to win the war. And you had a major event on August 9th, which was the Soviets officially entering the war, which some people say is actually what caused Japan's ultimate surrender. And so the fact that rather than just using the one nuclear weapon, or at least waiting a couple days until, after the Soviets entered the war before dropping the nuclear bomb, just to make sure, that this is something we absolutely have to do, it seemed like it was, rushing it to take the opportunity while it was still there. And I guess that goes to probably the most disturbing part about the nuclear bombings overall, is that it definitely wasn't necessary. And it's nothing other than, war crimes and mass murder. And it comes out of the legacy of like two presidents who are really glorified by, the modern day progressives. I know FDR didn't drop the bomb, but he built it and set it all up and basically, handed Truman the keys, and another somebody who's often celebrated. And some of the most horrific crimes, and maybe the most horrific crimes ever committed on the planet.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting how, like when you intern, Japanese civilians and drop nuclear bombs on them, how progressives will like celebrate you. It's very strange. I guess all you have to do is, implement some welfare or something, and you can get away with this kind of mass murder and be lionized still.
Right. Donald Trump's a Nazi, but FDR, Joe Biden will be the greatest president, says FDR. And it's like, okay, so how many people is he gonna intern? Like, what? Like, there's no recognition of it at all. I don't know. So, do you have anything else on this, Will? I think I've had about enough of talking about nuclear atrocities for the week. It's a very grim subject, but the unfortunate thing is that we haven't made any progress in the past, especially decade, since the New START agreement, in reducing nuclear stockpiles, reducing nuclear tensions. And actually, if you look at things, it seems like the threats to use nuclear weapons from just about every party on the planet has increased. The U.S. towards Russia, Russia even built smaller range nuclear weapons, missiles, to point to China. China's got issues with India. India's got issues with Pakistan. Yeah. Israel's got issues with Iran. North Korea's got issues with the U.S. The U.S. has issues with North Korea and Iran, and just about everybody else on the planet that isn't in NATO, Israel, or Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, it seems like, there's a lot of reasons why the nuclear scientists put their, doomsday clock at 100 seconds to midnight. And that's, you have not just what could happen with the U.S., but with any of these other scenarios around the world, and set off a chain of events that, if not, if it's India and Pakistan, it's obviously not going to vaporize Americans off the planet, but it's going to really impact, global environment and shipping and weather and all this dust and, crop growth. And it's going to be very impactful and lead to a lot of people starving to death and, just having less resources and really hurting, the wealth of everybody on the planet, not to mention, again, the millions or potentially billions of people who would be vaporized in one of these Asian nuclear conflicts should it break out. And there's really no pressure or no concern to get rid of it. Everybody's climate change. But, as the great economist Bob Murphy has pointed out, the effects of climate change are very minuscule over the long term. But when you look at something like nuclear weapons, I mean, we're minutes away from destroying life on the planet.
Right. I mean, we've covered on the show about like how even a small scale nuclear conflict or exchange between India and Pakistan would like devastate the world food supply and like, it'd be an absolute catastrophe. So even a small scale conflict like that would just be a nightmare. And yeah, I mean, I hope people see and can tell that like this is the most important issue in the world. Like when you and I talk about foreign policy, this is ultimately, I think, what like sort of centers us. That like, we care so much about U.S.-Russia relations and U.S.-China relations because these are nuclear arsenals. They have hydrogen bombs that can wipe out vast swaths of the Earth's population. So it is the most important issue in the world, I think, like objectively, just in terms of like the potential impact it could have. So, it is important to spend some time on this issue.
All right. Well, tell people where they find your work.
Yeah, if people want to read what I write, the best place to find me is at my Twitter handle, @TheWillPorter. I recently just changed it, but that's where you can find me now. And I have author archives at Consortium News, the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and the Daily Sheeple.
All right, everybody. And I'm at Kyle Anslone _ on Twitter. And you find me at the Libertarian Institute. On the homepage, you have my news roundup and the show. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, Kyle.